everyone, Camilla here from Decodable Readers Australia. Today we have a very special guest on our show that I'm interviewing so that we can get an insightful understanding of the importance of decodable readers. Pamela Snow is Professor of Cognitive Psychology and co-director of the Solar Lab. That's the science of language and reading at the School of Education, Trobe University. All right, so today we welcome Professor Pamela Snow to our show, and Pamela's going to share with us an insightful understanding of how we use decodable readers in our classroom and the role that they play. Thank you, Pamela, for joining us.
Thank you, Camilla, and thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to be with you. Look, I was delighted, along with a lot of other people, to see the recent announcement coming out of New South Wales about the provision of decodable texts to primary schools in that state, because I see decodable texts as a logical, pedagogical tool to use in the early stages, first 1 to 2 years maximum, in my view, ideally, of reading instruction in the context where children are being explicitly taught about how the English writing system works. I think if you'll indulge me for a minute, it's worthwhile saying a thing or two about the English writing system, because when people understand some of its idiosyncrasies, I think it makes the use of explicit teaching plus decodable texts make a lot more sense. We've inherited a writing system that comes down to us through the ages, representing the many and varied influences on English that have occurred historically for 1,000, 1,500 years, even longer, through the course of wars and trade and immigration, religion, a lot of religious influences on the history of English. Our language today is a real potpourri of influences from Latin, from Greek, of course, from old Anglo-Saxon, Celtic tongues. The Norman invasion in 1066 meant that French was the dominant language spoken in England. And English has been what I often say is a bowerbird in terms of how it's loved to pick up bright, shiny things from other languages and just take them as their own. So, and of course, all of those words have come into our language with their spellings that represent their pronunciations in their language of origin. So sometimes people erroneously say, oh, English is a random language. We can't teach English spelling because it's too random. Kids have just got to work it out for themselves and what have you. But that's actually incorrect from a linguistic perspective. It's not a random language at all. It's a rule-governed language. But children need to learn the rules, because we've ended up with what's often referred to as a semi-transparent orthography or writing system, not a transparent orthography like languages like Italian and Spanish and Finnish, where there's that lovely one-to-one correspondence between the sounds that come out of our mouth and the letters that appear on the page. So we've got this semi-transparent orthography that very learned scholars have been tinkering with for hundreds of years, and yet we take 5-year-olds and say, okay, you've got about 36 months to get your head around this uniquely complex system, where children in countries that have a transparent orthography only need 6 to 9 months to get their head around their writing system. Ours is so complex that we allow pretty much the bulk of the first 3 years of formal schooling is devoted in large part, not entirely, but in large part, to children mastering the writing system. So coming back to decodable text, they, to my mind, make the most logical prop to use for children if we're teaching them explicitly about how their writing system works. And I think, if I had to back a horse in the race here, I think there's plenty of evidence to say the best horse in the reading instruction race is the structured explicit literacy instruction horse, rather than horses that we might call whole language or we might call balanced literacy. They will get some children there for sure, but the cognitive psychology research tells us that we should be confidently getting 95% of children across the bridge to successful reading, writing, and spelling. Anything less than that is not success. So if I had to start with a blank piece of paper about the way reading was going to be taught in a school or a system or a jurisdiction, I would absolutely say we need teachers who are very knowledgeable about how their writing system works, and the teaching should be delivered in a way that has a scope and sequence around how phonemes, sounds, and letters, graphemes map to each other, and they map in obviously a two-way direction. And for most proponents of structured literacy instruction, that involves starting with the simple code and working up to the complex code in terms of the actual instruction that's occurring in the classroom. And then children need to be practicing what they're learning, and that's where decodable texts come in. So they're an opportunity for children to practice reading books that have been written by people who are knowledgeable about the English writing system and its idiosyncrasies, and knowledgeable about how children learn, and giving them opportunities to practice things that they've already learned in the classroom, so that they are not being asked to guess and look for information elsewhere as to what an unfamiliar word might be. And they're not being asked to use context cues and other low impact strategies that are not efficient and are not teaching transferable skills. So decodable texts help us to teach children transferable skills and give them the confidence that although their writing system does have some idiosyncrasies in terms of its density, it is a writing system that can be managed, and the process of decoding is a reliable, trustworthy one. That doesn't mean that there aren't situations where they need to call on information from context. Of course, that does apply, and it applies as the text becomes more complex. But in the early stages, decoding skills should yield success.
And what we see quite often in this transition of knowledge is the introduction of phonics in a systematic and synthetic way, but then moving to, or having some part of balanced literacy still evident. So you've got this explicit instruction happening for 20 minutes, and then they move to reading groups with books that aren't decodable, so it's not linking and practicing
exactly
been taught.
And I see that a lot in my work with schools where there's been an aha moment on the part of the teachers that they need to teach more explicitly, but they haven't quite got over that conceptual bridge of making sure that what they're asking children to read is giving them opportunities to practice what they've been learning. And when children are reading predictable, or sometimes called leveled texts, the composition, the sublexical, the below the word composition of the words can be all over the place, because often there's quite a repetitive stem, for example, like, I love spending time with my mother, auntie, grandfather, brother. So all of those words have got very different challenges associated with them in terms of what's happening at a sublexical level. And it's only natural that 5-year-olds who've been using oral language for, 5 years before they come to school will revert to using a system and a knowledge base that is more secure and more known. It's human, really, for us to take the easy option, and guessing really plays to that humanness of what's easy here. But decoding is actually a difficult skill to learn. And something that I often hear from teachers who've made this shift is that it seems to be a lot more effortful for young readers when they're practicing on decodable texts versus what they're used to seeing in the past with students who are using predictable texts. And I see that as a very good sign. So that's a sign that things are working. It's a sign that those mental cogs are turning for the child in terms of them doing that early orthographic mapping, understanding how phonemes and graphemes link to each other, working towards automaticity of something that we need to remember is actually unnatural for children to do. So the oral language piece is biologically natural. And as I said, children have been doing that for 5 years when they come to school and continue to use oral language right across the day, as they should. But reading, writing and spelling are biologically unnatural skills that children go to school to learn, in the same way that, algebra and trigonometry are not things that we do in a natural, automatic way. And so the effort that we see students expending should be seen as a positive sign. But I do emphasise that I see decodable texts as, the analogy that's often used, and you can pull this analogy apart, but the one that's often used is the one of training wheels on a bike. Someone said to me on Twitter the other day, I should be talking about balance wheels and not training wheels, because apparently there's a difference. But I still think the analogy holds up, that we don't expect children to get on a bike and balance themselves perfectly and turn corners and ride down hills and do all the things that they will ultimately do on bikes. We support them to do the most basic things first, and as they become more confident and more competent, and all the while we're maintaining their motivation by giving them a sense of achievement, then the reliance on the training wheels can be diminished. And I see decodable texts fitting into that category very well.
Yeah, absolutely. And
someone said to me, someone pointed out on my blog the other day that we should be talking about controlled texts and or phonically controlled texts, and I accept that feedback. I think that, linguistically, pedagogically, that's probably a better term. But of course, in an everyday sense, we talk about decodable texts.
Yeah, yes. That they're connected to what's being explicitly taught, so that there's not extended code that hasn't been taught, that you either have to memorize or use picture clues, context clues, and all of those.
Yep.
So,
or give up because the whole thing seems too hard.
Yes. Now, you mentioned about that automaticity. It's like anything that we learn, whether it's driving a car. I know that my children are about to embark on that journey. And
good luck.
Thank you. There's just so much to learn that's automated for us. When we jump into a car, we know all those different things to use: the mirrors, the brakes, the gears. But for them, it was really an analogy that aligned. When children are learning to read, there's so much going on that their brains are cognitively processing. We need to be able to use decodable text to get that automaticity at that word level. And then we can also concentrate, when we've got some automaticity there, concentrate on that language comprehension and understanding more rich text. And we do that still alongside, but we read to the children. Is that something that...
yes, absolutely. And I'm reminded listening to you talk, Camilla, of the Scarborough reading rope, and I think it is important that we adopt the perspective of the novice when we're talking about early reading. So we're not talking about us as expert readers in the same way that when we think about teaching a 17-year-old how to drive, we have to get into the mind and the shoes and the seat of the novice and understand that there are a lot of things that we do very fluidly and automatically. And when we go to teach them, we realize just how many small components and small steps that there are. And the Scarborough reading rope, because it starts off on the left-hand side from the perspective of the novice with all of those isolated language comprehension and decoding or alphabetic knowledge skills, and over time those skills become more closely connected to each other and automaticity increases. And that's really a nice demonstration, I think, of what it means to go from novice to expert in a general sense, and the level of support that's needed in the classroom to allow students to do that. And of course, sometimes people say, oh, but they're not linguistically rich texts. Well, predictable texts are not exactly linguistically rich either. But I think it's fair to say that texts we ask young children to read should be giving them an opportunity to practice reading, practice the skills of reading, in the same way that when you take your 17-year-old out on their first drive on the road, it's not meant to be necessarily a relaxing motoring experience. It's practicing using some isolated skills. And we should be exposing children to lots of rich language, rich spoken language, but also, of course, reading to them from beautiful children's books, and there are plenty of those around, and they typically use vocabulary that's higher order than everyday vocabulary, and they typically use sentence structures that are a bit more complex, and they allow children to understand narrative structure and cause and effect and inferencing and prediction and so forth. So that should all be happening alongside this process of skill development and teaching transferable skills.
Absolutely. Now, you've written a recent blog. I'm going to put the link with this video. I really love this blog because it makes that connection to the known. I know that there's some challenge out there around decodables, and are they aligned to current research? But when we look at everything that you've just spoken about, clearly they have their place and their purpose. But your blog in particular makes this link to mask wearing. What's the current research out there? But even without looking at the current research, it makes sense to protect yourself and protect your community by doing this act. And that I just love the analogy and the link to decodable text. Well, what's the other option? It's those leveled readers that take the focus off the words. So with or without research, it makes sense that if you're teaching with that structured synthetic phonics approach, that you use texts that are aligned to that approach, and that approach is backed by research.
Correct. And there is research out there, like, many other aspects of developmental psychology. There's conflicting research, there's incomplete research. But as I say in the blog post, if I had to put things in a rank order based on current evidence, accepting all of the imperfections of current evidence, I would still put explicit teaching plus use of decodable texts, both underpinned by highly knowledgeable teachers. I would still put that on the top of my list, and that's the bet I'd take to the horse races. Explicit teaching, knowledgeable teachers, decodable texts that are used for a time-limited period, because we're skill building and opening children's doors and lives to the possibility that all of the possibilities that reading entails.
Lovely. Now, just finally, we would really love to connect our community. I know that you're affiliated and you're a professor at Trobe University. If there
Yes.
are schools and teachers wanting to increase their knowledge and enroll in courses, how do they go about making that connection?
Okay, so my colleague Tanya Seri and I run a number of short courses through our SOLAR lab, the Science of Language and Reading lab. So if people Google La Trobe and SOLAR lab, they'll find our website. I'm not sure when you're planning to distribute this video, but we do have a short course, an introductory short course starting in the second half of August, and registrations close for that on the 4th of August. So that's getting pretty soon.
Yeah, we'll make sure we release that before then so that they can...
Okay, great. So that'll be the third iteration of the introductory short course, and we're also doing a short course later in the year for secondary teachers. And then next year we'll rerun the intermediate level short course. So, and we've been able to keep the cost of those really very modest. And we also are able to offer discounts for schools that enroll 10 or more staff to make it easier to undertake a whole school journey.
Wonderful. Well, we'll find those links and we'll put those links in.
Thanks, Camilla. If you can't find them, let me know and I can send them through to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time and your insightful knowledge and sharing that with us today.
That's a pleasure. It's been lovely talking to you, Camilla.
Thank you.